collecting pollen, so you can tell whether they're collecting pollen or whether they're just visiting for nectar. So pollen visiting honeybees, nectar visiting honeybees, Lasioglossum is a sweat bee, and then the blue orchard bees and the syrphid fly. So you can see with the exception of Osmia lignaria and the syrphid fly, everyone seems to be a pretty good pollinator. I don't know what's up with evidences here, but we've had very small sample sizes for some of this, so I haven't run any statistics on it. But just giving you an idea of what we saw. So based on this, I would say everything except for these two are a pretty good pollinator. Really disappointing with the Osmia because we had these bees, they were set up in the middle of 40 kilometers worth of haskap in full bloom. They had to go literally, a meter away from their nest to collect pollen, and instead they decided to leave the orchard and go get some salix. So I don't know what's up with them. That data represents only one single afternoon though, so this next year we're hoping to bring in, we're not hoping, we're actually bringing in a whole lot of more bees, and we're going to analyze them across the whole season and see if this changes, because everything I know about Osmia says that they should be great haskap pollinators, and the data just isn't saying. So I just want to confirm that real quick. So don't run out and go buy a whole bunch of blue orchard bees just yet. So this next summer, as I said, those indirect measures, they're not very good at telling exactly how good a pollinator is. So if we look directly at it, we can actually look at exactly how much pollen does a pollinator deposit on the stigma for a single visit. So before flowers open, we throw an exclusion bag over there so we know that it hasn't been visited. Once the flower opens, we pull off that bag and we sit there and we wait for a bee or a fly or whatever to visit the flower. So he comes along, he visits the flower, he takes off. And then we can actually take that stigma, mount it in that fuchsia jelly again, and count the amount of pollen that was deposited. So this here is the stigma. All these purple things are the haskap grains. And so we can actually find out exactly how much pollen was deposited on that single visit. And just a little bit of an aside here. So with most flowers, when they do this, it's a single flower leading to a single berry. With haskap, of course, we have two flowers leading to a single berry. And so we have two scenarios that could be happening here with the pollen. So scenario one, we have pollen deposited on the stigma, travels down. Each stigma only fertilizes one half of that berry or one ovary. Scenario two, we could have some kind of crossing over happening here, where pollen deposited on one stigma can fertilize either side of the ovary. So in this case, we need pollination of both of those flowers to get a full berry developing. In this case, we could have pollination of just one and still get a perfect berry. I put this up here more as a theoretical thing, and I do want to do some experiments to test which one it is. I really suspect it's this because there is no real precedent I've found for this. But it gets at that question of why would this system evolve? If it was this, it would be really interesting because it would just be a way of ensuring fertilization of that berry. So enhancing the stigmatic surface. But for the rest of my talk, I am going to just kind of assume this model here. And just quickly, the way that we would test for this is we have 3 different trials. So in the first trial, we cut off one of the stigmas before it's been pollinated. This one removed both of the stigmas, and the last we leave intact. And then based on the kind of berry that we get from these trials, we can determine whether it's scenario 1 or scenario 2. So if we get a lopsided berry from this first trial, we know that we need pollination of both of the flowers. If we get a normal berry, then we know there's some kind of crossing over there happening. We actually tried to do this last year, and we went out and we cut off tons and tons of stigmas and left, and then we came back to look at the berries, and we had only tagged the branch. And so on branches where we had treated maybe 2 or 3 flowers, we came back and there was like a dozen berries on the branch. We didn't realize that haskap would keep growing, putting out more flowers. So that was disappointing, lots of work for nothing. But we're going to go back and try it again and label things better and get some results from this. So live and learn. So getting back to this, again, assuming that we need pollen on both of these stigmas. And again, if we do have that kind of split where we need pollination of both of the flowers, there's potential for asymmetry too. So if we have a bee come and only visits one, and that flower doesn't get visited again, we could get, again, a lopsided berry. So asymmetry is something I'm looking at, and also how much pollen was deposited. So this is just some theoretical data that I might end up with. So here is the number of pollen grains deposited per single visit on each of the stigmas, so stigma 1, stigma 2, and then the species here. And so, again, totally theoretical, but based on this, we ended up with this. We can say that species 2 here is the most effective pollinator because it moves the most pollen onto that stigma. But it's also very asymmetric, whereas species 4, less effective but more symmetric. So depending on how that actually affects development and what the minimum pollen requirements are, one could be more desirable over the other. So again, that's effectiveness. That's just pollen moving around. But what we're interested in is how this actually translates to fruit set. So if we think about pollen to seed development, you can't just keep adding pollen and keep getting a bigger and bigger and bigger fruit. That doesn't make sense. It's going to top out at a certain point. So we can figure out exactly how many seeds there are in a haskap fruit and then look at pollen viability. And using those measures, we can figure out what's the minimum amount of pollen that we need on that stigma in order to get full development of that fruit. So this is something, again, that we haven't done yet, but if we're just going to say it's about 20, and we put that on there, then we can see that even though species 2 is a more effective pollinator than species 3, they're equally efficient. They both deposit enough pollen to get full development of the fruit. So this is just a real-world example of this. So this is the kind of data we want to get for haskap. This is a study done by Kane and Schiffauer in 2003. We have the different they were looking at the effectiveness of pollinators on cranberry. So what they did was they measured single visit deposition for different bee species here, and then this is the number of pollen tetrads that were deposited on each stigma, and this is the number of fruit that actually translated into. So if we look at those first 2 species, this is Bombus affinis on the top, Megachile addenda here, we can see that Bombus affinis is twice as effective as a pollinator as Megachile. However, if we look at the actual fruit set, the results from that, these are not statistically different. So even though it's the first one is twice as effective, they're equally efficient as pollinators. So that's why it's important to differentiate between the 2, because you can't just look at pollen and translate that to your real world yield. So this is just, you guys probably don't want to see equations, but it's a really simple equation. So on a per individual basis, which species is going to produce more seeds per day? So this first part here, this is just the amount of pollen that would be deposited on the stigmas per visit. And then we can do surveys and figure out exactly how many flowers can an individual visit per time interval, and then how many hours are they active during the day. So there's some species, especially in the spring when it's cooler, there's some species that might be active very early in the morning. For example, bumblebees, they're very cold tolerant, they're going to be active probably all day. Whereas your honeybees or some of your sweat bees, they might not come out till the afternoon. So the amount of hours that they're active is going to be important as well. And so we times that all by the number of visits they make per day, and that gives us a nice clean number, and then I can rank the species and say, okay, this is the best pollinator for this crop. And so for things like bumblebees, you can't really directly control how many of them are going to be in your orchard. You can take measures to increase populations by providing forage and habitat and all that stuff, but it's kind of just a hope game, right? Whereas with your honeybees and your blue orchard bees, because they're a managed species, you can actually directly control. So you can send off an order and say, hey, I need exactly 1,000 female blue orchard bees, and they'll show up at your door and you throw them out there. So again, it'd be really useful if I could tell you exactly how many bees do I need for my orchard. So again, just a really simple equation. Figure out how many inflorescences are open on a shrub at peak flowering, the number of shrubs you have in the orchard, and then the number of visits that are needed to fully pollinate those flowers per species. And that's easily gotten from the last equation. And then again, the number of visits per hour, and the hours active per day. So we're just getting the total number of visits we need, divide that by the number of visits possible. Sorry. And that gives us the number of pollinators that we need. So that's that. And that's pretty much my presentation, but I did just want to digress about bumblebees for a little while, just because they're awesome. They're super cute. How can you not love that face? But also, I think they really are an important, going to be the most important pollinator in terms of native pollinators for haskap, and they're probably the ones doing the most work for you out there. So if we want to encourage them within the orchard and make sure we have large populations of them to do the pollination, there's some just interesting things about their life cycle that I can talk about. So just in a really simple to their life cycle, they are a semi-social bee. So what happens is, eusocial bee. The bumblebee queens, they emerge from hibernation in the spring, so they'll start coming out at the end of April, and they establish a new colony. So just the queen comes out, she starts foraging for her first brood. So she goes out, she gets pollen, she gets nectar, she builds the pollen balls, she lays the eggs on there, she takes care of that whole first brood. Once that first brood is mature, they start going out and collecting. So this is what you guys are probably familiar with honeybees. For the honeybees, the workers will go out and collect, and the queen just stays home and lays eggs. So this is more similar to that. So the first brood goes out, they take over foraging, the queen stays home, lays eggs. The colony will continue to grow throughout the summer, depending on resources that are available. And later in the summer, the colony starts to produce reproductives. So the males and the new queens. And once those have emerged, the new queens mate with the males, and then everyone else dies off. So all the old queen, the workers, the males, they all die. The new queens go back into hibernation, and the cycle repeats. So there's two parts of this cycle that are really important to you guys as haskap growers. So right here, the queen forages for her first brood. This coincides with haskap flowering. So as I said before, it's the queens that are out there. It's not workers. And this means there's much lower populations than there's going to be later in the year because it's just the queens. Later on, you have all of her offspring out there foraging. But at this point, it's just her. And in order to have high numbers there, we need high numbers here. And because haskap only flowers for that little period in the beginning, we need lots of resources, lots of food for them during this whole cycle in order to get high numbers here again. So the key to that is suitable nesting habitat for your bumblebees and year-round forage. So it's pretty easy to do, and there's really win-win. I don't mind people who don't do this. So year-round flowering, this can mean growing different crops, and a lot of you guys probably grow different fruit crops together, staggering them so that they're flowering in different periods. There's always forage available for the bees. You can also seed native meadows, so if you have any unused land around, throw some wildflowers in there. The butterflies, the bees, everything will thank you for it. They're pretty too. Shelter belts, so what you put in your shelter belt, if you put something that's going to flowering shrubs, flowering trees. Willow is a really, really popular bee flower, or bee plant, bee tree. And also shelter belts also offer habitat for your bees, which I'll get into in the next slide. You can allow the flowers to grow in your lawns and ditches. This means dandelions. If you guys hate dandelions, it's bad news for you, but bees love dandelions. If you can live with them, hanging out on your lawn, bees love them. And then wildflower gardens. They don't have to be native wildflowers necessarily, but be careful if you're planting ornamentals. So a lot of flowers that have been domesticated and used just for looks, they don't actually even have pollen or nectar available, so they're useless to bees. So whatever you plant, make sure that it does have pollen and nectar, and you will attract the bees. And then lastly, homes for bees. So different bees do different things as far as where they live. So bumblebees, they usually live in abandoned burrows, so old rodent holes, things like that. Mining bees, so these are Andrena, your sweat bees. They actually excavate their own tunnels, so if you leave open, bare areas, and especially in sandy soil, they'll just excavate their own holes. If you see these little holes in the ground, they often don't have like when you see an ant hole, they have the dirt assembled around there. That's an ant hole, but bee holes usually are more open. Sometimes they even have a turret kind of coming out. So if you can leave those alone, don't cover up all those holes. That's really good for those kind of bees. Mason bees and leafcutter bees, these are the ones that live in the little tunnels. So any kind of little hole, they'll live in old stems. You can make these little bee houses for them. If you Google like bee hotels, there's some really cool, intricate ones that people have made. Even if you have old buildings on your property, they'll live in old nail holes even, depending on the size of the bee. They'll pick different sizes, but even the little tiny ones, they'll build their nests right in there. If you want to go over to your neighbor's porch and drill some holes directly in there, that'd be great. Don't do that, actually. But even old log piles laying around, basically anything that they can get into a cavity, they're going to build in there. And in agricultural systems, there's some work that's been done by my supervisor, Corey Sheffield, has shown that in agricultural systems, nesting sites are really the most limiting factor for these groups. So anything that you can do to give them something to nest in will help. And that's pretty much all I have, so I just wanted to acknowledge everyone that's been involved in this project, and especially to thank you guys for inviting me and for listening so attentively. And I just wanted to say before I give up the floor here, we are putting together some